approaching the 4 o'clock hour. Grayson Grundhoefer, 365 Sports, SicEm365.com, joins us as he does on Fridays. Grayson, let's discuss the offensive lineman from UT Chattanooga. I know that they had the Cash Courtney decommit to Arkansas where Eric Mateos is, but let's start with UT Chattanooga offensive lineman Truett and exactly what he brings to the table. He seems to be wanted by a lot of other nice schools. And what kind of an offseason overall now from the transfer portal that Baylor has had in the offensive line depth chart?
Right. So, this is kind of one that I would say happened relatively quickly. We talked about a little bit on SicEm 365, the premium side of things, and I've mentioned his name for a little over a month now. He was always a guy that was on the radar for the Baylor staff, but it looked like he kind of took his time with his recruitment, to be honest. Schools like South Carolina, Indiana, Missouri, Arkansas, Virginia were all in on him. And then, of course, this past weekend, he visited Kansas State, and he went ahead and committed to Chris Kleiman and the Wildcats over the weekend. But he had the visit to Baylor lined up still, and he stayed true and took that visit to Baylor and saw what he needed to see from the Baylor program, to be honest. And it was enough to get him to flip from his extremely recent commitment to Kansas State, flip to Baylor. And it's really big for Baylor, I think, as far as what they're trying to build on the offensive line. It's an area they've addressed heavily through the transfer portal, receiving commitments from Omar Igbedian, Kurt Daniker, Colton Thomason, Sidney Fugar, and now Colin Truett. So they've really spent a lot of scholarship spots on that position, and they're really trying to really anchor that group so that they can move the football next year. Now, Truett has played a lot of right tackle during his time at Chattanooga, but I think he's going to slide into guard for Baylor. He's about 6'3", 305 pounds, might be a little bit bigger than that. But I think that's where he's going to slide in. I think he could be the starter immediately for Baylor potentially, but at minimum, a really, really good depth piece and a guy that gives them some versatility while also giving them a ton of experience as he only has one season of eligibility remaining.
So, Grayson, they've done a lot to attack the O-line, as you mentioned. They've added a ton of transfers. So where are they in terms of any further possible additions? Is the roster finally set, or is there still stuff out there? And if so, what remains to you, whether they've addressed it or not, what remains to you the biggest questions? And maybe that's still the O-line.
I think there's still room as far as the scholarship situation goes. I think it's, right around, I would have said one spot this past week, which is obviously what Colin Truett would fill. But I think there might be a little bit more than that coming off of this week. And so that's still a question that, is yet to be answered. But I do believe there's a couple spots left. Now, as far as, what Baylor may be looking at, potentially the offensive line. Potentially, I think they could be looking at some kind of best player available situations as well. I also think you could look at the roster and maybe they decide to put a walk-on scholarship or something along those lines as well. But I think there's some room there. So I wouldn't say they're done at this very moment, but Colin Truett definitely gets them closer to that.
Can you try to explain the makeup of who they are now? With, as you mentioned, there's still work to be done. There's always work to be done. But who they are now compared to who they were when they ended last season in the offensive line?
It's leaps and bounds. They are so different up front. Everything has changed in so many regards. And yet we still may look at this offensive line and you might see three guys who were starters by the end of last year be the starters this year. And I know some people may not be huge fans of that, but when you look at it from a kind of a different lens and you're talking about guys who are growing up and developing, when I talk about guys like Colton Price or Alvin Ebasele, who were redshirt freshmen last year, asked to play a whole lot last season, a whole lot more than was anticipated. And they ended up being starters by the end of the year. And then you had Campbell Barrington, who came in from BYU last year, had all these expectations and did not perform up to the level that they needed him to at left tackle. So he moved to right tackle and ended the year there. And so you look at those three, you got three guys that I think you feel confident about being in the top 8. It just really comes down to, are those guys going to end up being starters? And then outside of that, you're talking about, upgrades, right? When you look at guys like Sidney Fugar and Omar Igbedian and Colton Thomason, and Kurt Daniker, you're just talking about some older guys, but then you also are talking about talent, guys who are very talented, who you think come in and maybe raise your ceiling. And I think that's what you get with Colton Thomason, who was, a 4-star guy in his 2023 class, and now just a redshirt freshman, has 4 years of eligibility. And then Sidney Fugar, who athletically is going to really jump off the screen to a lot of people. It's just a matter of, can he develop and put it all together during his time at Baylor, which he wasn't quite able to do at South Carolina. So still some questions. I think overall people should still have questions about the offensive line. But I do think from last year being really bad, one of the worst Power 5 offensive lines in the country, to where they are now, which I think is bordering on being average, is massive. And I know that sounds, maybe pessimistic, saying, oh, they're just average. But when you go from being, outside the top 100 offensive line-wise to being around the 70s, it's huge for your offense as a whole. And so I think they've done a really nice job, and they needed to, frankly.
I just think it's crazy that you need like 6 offensive linemen in a season. That just shows you that's nuts. Like to where the development was, and just guys not panning out. And I understand changes in coaching as well, which leads me to Cash Courtney and his decommit from Baylor. He is headed to Arkansas. So there's the Eric Mateos relationship. Eric Mateos, the former Baylor O-line coach. So that makes some sense that, there would be some pull there for Cash Courtney. But what does it mean for this recruiting class and what they're eyeing and just kind of all that comes with that?
Right. So, Baylor's lost 3 offensive line commits in this class at one point or another. And, that just speaks to the fact that they've had 3 offensive line coaches in 6 months. And it's really hard to recruit that way. And Cash Courtney felt like the one who maybe would be the one that they hung on to, but he ultimately decided to, go rejoin Eric Mateos there at Arkansas. And now Baylor's got to really regroup there. And, to be honest, I'm not extremely optimistic with where they're at right now in the offensive line. I think they have a lot of work to do as far as sending out offers, as far as getting guys on campus. I think they're in a pretty good spot with a couple guys, which is good. But I think ultimately they really need to land guys who are difference makers there. And if they don't do that in this class, then I do think they'll look to the transfer portal again and try to add some guys who are very much like a Colton Thomason, who have quite a few years of eligibility remaining, but for whatever reason, it didn't work out early in their stop elsewhere. I think they could look that direction and also look for, older guys in the transfer portal as well. But as far as high school recruiting goes in this 2025 class, they have a long way to go as far as recruiting the offensive line, and Cash Courtney's decommitment just kind of points even more to that, and the kind of uphill battle that Mason Miller has, just given that he hasn't had a lot of time to try to figure this out and try to put it all together. I think by the end of this, they'll be fine, but I'm not, super optimistic that this is going to be a great offensive line class.
Why have they struggled to recruit offensive linemen?
Well, in this specific situation, I think it just simply comes down to the fact that Mason Miller has had, 3 months to try to recruit guys and, 3 different offensive line coaches in 6 months. That's really tough. And so you're talking about guys that they lost that committed under, with a different coach as their offensive line coach. And so it makes sense that these guys have decommitted, but also on the, Baylor side of things, it's a lot to do with relationships. And, it's asking a lot of a coach to come in and be able to put together an elite recruiting class at his position when there's been so much turnover and so many changes there. And so I think that's kind of what's going on as far as, in the past years. I feel like, there were some misses there as well under Eric Mateos. And so you kind of add that all together. And so you look at the roster and the depth isn't amazing. And then their current recruiting isn't amazing for multiple reasons. It just hasn't been great. And so now they kind of got to reset things, look for some guys to try to bring in on visits, try to find that next wave of recruits. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of that, but they got to turn this thing around pretty quickly because they don't have a lot of time to put this class together. The good news is you do have the transfer portal, which can make up for some of this. And I think it will.
Grayson, they've got these camps going on, these weekend visits. I know they had the first one last week. We talked about that on the podcast, but just, I guess, what are your thoughts now? It's been a few days since we talked. Anything of note or just, I guess, what to be on the lookout for Baylor fans out there curious about the recruiting this weekend?
So there's a few things kind of going on, I would say. I think Baylor's going to actually add their first commit in the 2026 class pretty soon, if not today. So I think they're on the verge of kind of getting that class rolling as well, even though we're a long way away from that, final signing day for the 2026 class. But getting started there would be a huge step in a good direction, I think, for Baylor. Now, as far as visits go, last weekend they landed one commit off of the visits, and that was Chase Collier, the wide receiver out of Florida. Got him locked in. He becomes the second wide receiver commit in the class. And then you kind of look at the rest of the guys who visited, and a lot of them have decisions coming up. Klein Collins, linebacker, Trent Spence, he announced that he's going to be making his decision on Monday, and I think that'll be coming off of a visit to Cal. But I feel pretty good about Baylor's chances there to land a really athletic and a really good fit at linebacker. So that's kind of something to keep an eye on going towards Monday. Outside of that, you got all these guys are basically looking to make decisions at the end of June or the beginning of July for the most part. So you look at guys like Sheldon Rice, Bryson Weber, Jaden Sanders, Caleb Burns. These are guys that are high profile guys who Baylor's been recruiting really heavily, and they're going to be making decisions really soon. And then you turn over to this upcoming weekend, it's very much the same thing. Guys like Jackson Blackwell and Jalen Cooper and Leo Almanza. These guys are trying to make decisions by the end of the month or the very beginning of July. So a lot of movement is going to come over the next 3 weeks. And I would say in general, Baylor did a good job the first weekend. I know people are disappointed with how many commits they landed. But you kind of got to remember that these visits are set well in advance, and a lot of these guys have dates for commitment set as well. And so that kind of extends the process a little bit. Going into this weekend, the biggest things are really the offensive playmakers. You got Caden Knighton, the running back commit, four-star prospect. He's committed. He's the only commit on the visit this weekend. But besides him, you also have a four-star running back in Michael Turner, a four-star receiver in Ja'Cory Watson, a four-star receiver in Jalen Cooper, and another four-star receiver in Jacob Washington. So really heavy focus on the offensive playmakers. Add that in with a guy like Kamarian Morgan, who's out of South Oak Cliff, and he's one of the top 100 prospects in the country at edge. And it kind of tells you how high profile this weekend is. And I know a lot of Baylor fans are going to be really intrigued by two other ones, and that's La Vega offensive lineman, defense lineman Ethan Thompson, and then Lorena defense lineman Jackson Blackwell, because those two guys are local guys and guys that Baylor really, really wants to solidify the nose tackle position. Now it's just kind of about, can the staff land these two guys who know about the Baylor program so well, and they would fit so well in Baylor's defense? Can Baylor ultimately land those guys? Because as we know, landing local guys hasn't been a sure thing in the past. So we'll see if they're able to do that.
All right, so I know that Baylor the season doesn't start till the last week in August for Baylor, first week in September. Do you get a good read on right now, if the season started this weekend, who would be the starting quarterback?
I've been of this belief for a long time now, and I'm still here with it. I still think DeQuan Finn is going to be the starting quarterback that first game. Now, I can't tell you that it comes off of anything that I've heard recently, just kind of about, how things are trending. But I just feel like over the course of spring ball, I felt like things trended his way just a little bit more. And the vibes just kind of told me that he was going to end up being the guy. We'll see if that ends up happening. Sora Robertson definitely had a very good spring camp, and there's definitely a competition there for sure. And I think it's a great thing that's going into the fall. But I still think ultimately DeQuan Finn will be the starting quarterback for Baylor that week one matchup. And I don't think I'm going to waver from that until we hear, something that's confirmed.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Grayson Grundhoefer, Sikkim365.com, 365 Sports, recruiting analyst, football analyst, men's basketball, and also the Bearcast co-host with Craig every Tuesday on 365 Sports.
Hey, who doesn't need 5 transfer